Good afternoon. If we but noticed, if we paid attention, it would be pretty obvious that as we mature, or at least get older, age, more things tend to stay the same than change. And of course, I'm alluding to the interior life. Because one glance in the mirror would surely show the ravages of time. Aging shows on the body. The body changes. But I want to suggest, from observation, based on observation, then more stays the same in the interior life, in the interior being, then changes. The same holds true once you embark on your spiritual inquiry. Your personality, no matter where you are along the path, essentially remains intact. But there are subtle changes. Nothing really startling. Nothing that you could put your finger on. But something that changes is the dissolution of expectations. We've all had or have expectations, mostly ego and societal driven from outside forces, community, tribe, group, who burden us with expectations. And this is a notable, expectations just seem to vanish into thin air. Glasses, that's better. And this is a blessing. The skill at waiting improves, watching improves, listening improves. But these are in increments so infinitesimal that it's hard to consciously notice. But it does change in these levels takes place. But even though you recognize the Maya, the illusion of the being that the ego created, we do retain our personalities, the main features of who we are in this reflection of life that we're experiencing, that we're currently experiencing. There's a personality. And this personality, even through the whole process of non-abiding or progressive enlightenment, all the way through to abiding or permanent awakening, personality survives essentially unscathed. Who you were before is who you are after. And I have to caution here, I have to add that abiding awakening, permanent awakening is not static. The awakening process will continue. All it really means is that you recognize not only who you're not, but most importantly, who you are. An ordinary being in a sea of beings, brothers and sisters, who are composed of exactly the cosmic dust that you yourself are composed of. So it's more of a recognition. It's certainly not the end of the line, the top of the hill. For as you reach the top of one peak, you'll be intrigued to know that there's many more to come. This process is a continuum. So when you examine the characteristics that comprise your personality, you can see certain aspects that were there as long as you could remember. And one that I recognize and one that I want to talk about today is optimism. I've always been an optimist, even in the face of the contrary. People label me a dreamer, and I was always happy to accept and even try to live up to this label or expectation. And I became aware that optimism, when I look around me, optimism seems to disappear with age, to be replaced with its diametrically opposed, its polarity, its opposite. Pessimism. But honestly, I don't have a pessimistic bone in my body. I've been accused of being naive, and it's another label that I happily embraced. I saw it as a positive, even though it may have been intended to be a negative. And I learned to cultivate, to accept my state of mind, my state of thinking, which was couched in optimism. I saw it as enlightened naivete. So, being naive and uneducated, I went to this level of seeing it as enlightened naivete. And I went to my dictionary like I always do, because I wanted to share enlightened. We tend to think of enlightened, especially in the context of Zen with a smile, as some kind of being spiritually aware. But if you look in the dictionary, that's definition 2. The preferred, the most utilized definition of enlightened is having or showing a rational, modern, and well-informed outlook. Now here's some synonyms of this aspect of enlightened. Informed, aware, educated, knowledgeable, learned, wise, literate, intellectual, tutored, illuminated, apprised. All of these synonyms, all these other adjectives are used to describe a person, in this case, me, have to be worked at. None of these are just given. So with this enlightened naivete, I've been able to not only maintain my optimistic look on life, but to grow it, to expand it. And the enlightened part comes in when, as a result of the learning process, I didn't ignore everything that was happening around me that more readily lent itself to a pessimistic state. It was work to keep the optimism. And I don't mean this in a Pollyanna sense. Pollyanna implies being naive, not having much experience. Well, I've had at least my share of experience, and probably more. I remember an Indian astrologer telling me once that I live several lifetimes in one this time around, cramming in enough experiences to last a few to several lifetimes. A full life, as we say. And certainly disappointment, depression, denial have played a part, have had their place in my existence. But I never surrendered to the baser impulses. I say surrender for much more important impulses. Surrender to the fact that I don't know is probably the best answer, the most honest answer about any topic that I could come up with, because ultimately we don't know. Especially on an intellectual, rational sense. But most of who we are, our personality, that is only with us as long as we're in this body. Those of you that were hoping that this would continue, that you would always be you, well, you're in for a surprise. Those of you that were hoping to be anything but who you are, who your personality is, you can look forward to some relief. Just as when a wave breaks, an individual drops, return to the whole, return to the rest of the water. As I've said many times, because this analogy suits me best conveys my point here. And you're back into the universal whole. Now, as that individual dropped, you're exactly the same as the rest of the water. So it's part illusion, it's part habit, consequence of interaction, that we develop these personalities. And it's on this level of personality that will be with you until you take your last step, you breathe your last breath. And within the confines of that personality, you'll find appropriate times for emotions that you thought weren't worthy of you. And anger comes to mind. I won't go as far to say as there's a time for anger. But if you have an angry bone in your personality, don't be surprised, no matter where you are on your path, that it shows up. The important thing is don't be attached. Forgive yourself. And keep on keeping on. And why is retaining my optimism so important? First and foremost, I'm a rebellious soul. I don't like to fall into the cookie cutter expectations that we've grown to accept about living life. The conditional tense, should have, would have, could have, seems to me to be a part of this insidious effort from outside elements to tell you who or what you should be or do. Personally, I've never really had much spare time to spend telling anyone what they should or shouldn't or could or couldn't do. I've been too involved in the process of living, which to me means inquiry. That's the process of life. Remembering what you've always known. So how does optimism, how has it served me? Well, now, it's quite common to hear that being an optimistic, being a happy, looking for the best in everyone and everything actually slows down the aging process, or at least it allows you to enjoy life. And if I looked deeply and saw that what's the source for this constant state of optimism is that even in the lowest times, the lowest moments, all that's inevitable is change. So no matter what state I found myself in, I knew that this too would change. And when people talk about happiness, I get a little confused because happiness that they're seeking is unattainable in the reality that everything changes. If your happiness is based on things or people outside of you, well, obviously, they're not within your control. And I've come to learn that in my life, depression, sadness had its place and greatly contributed. I remember my ex-wife telling me that I would be a perfect candidate for Prozac because she couldn't deal with my bouts with depression, sometimes long-lasting bouts. So I went to see a psychiatrist at my university. I had returned to go to graduate school, so I was already older and set in my ways. And I remember talking to the psychiatrist. He says, "What's on your mind?" I said, "Well, my ex tells me I'd be a perfect candidate for Prozac." And he said, this is what I said as I entered the room. And he says, "Hey, sit down, I want to talk to you." And he told me, he listened to me, diagnosed me with dysthymia, which is a mild depression that's a long-lasting secular. The period of time between up and down, it's not manic by any means, it's gradual, but it's long-lasting. Up to 2 years could be a half cycle. A whole cycle could take up to 4 years, the whole cycle through the up and the down. And he said, I could prescribe I forgot the pill. Prozac, sorry. I could prescribe Prozac for you right now. But I wanted to warn you that you'll be in a pretty much constant, flat state. This is what this medication, this drug, offers. So that you can escape the lows, but you also don't experience the highs. And you'll find that your level of creativity might suffer. Because it's pretty well known that in times of darkness, some of the most creative energy, contribution from people of the past and the present take place in the throes of the deepest, darkest dungeons of our soul. Springs this creativity. And I don't know if you can connect the dots here, but perhaps you could see why we attaining my optimism, being in an optimistic state of mind, could be reinforced even looking at the darkest times, to understand, to see so much good can come from what seems so bad. This made me optimistic, while happiness proved much more elusive. In fact, when I was experienced something that really made me happy, especially when it came from a source outside of me, I immediately think that this too will change. So I didn't get attached to this. I accepted it with the same equanimity that I accepted the times of depression and sadness, gladness and sadness. Not too far removed from each other. Sadness slips into gladness, which slips into sadness. Now, what I did try to pay attention to is that being an optimistic man, times of gladness needed to be equally creative. It seems like I was sacrificing half my time. If creativity only sprung from the darkness, and no creativity sprung from the lightness. Times when you feel light, times when you feel that your feet aren't even touching the ground. I chose to strive to be equally creative. I certainly didn't want to just wait for the bad times to add for creativity to flower. Optimism meant to me judicially using the time that you have, regardless of the outside conditions. Judicial use. And judicial use meant incorporating times of rest, downtime, when necessary, to rejuvenate, to be able to go out and about, times of withdrawal from the world so that you could encounter it again, so that you could bring something good to the opportunity of encountering people, places, and things. And the fact that I was able to utilize my given time, moment by moment, which I understood as not only all that's real, but more importantly, it's all I have, is this moment. And optimism, the sense of peace that I experience by not being vested in anything that's subject to change. To look for the timeless, the unchangeable. To live in the timeless. To live in the unchangeable. How can that fail to evoke optimism? So I called this talk, teaching, sharing, I called this sharing, that optimism is not only for the young. Optimism, like all lasting things, is simply a choice. It's a sophisticated choice not a naive understanding. A time to surrender. A time to forget. A time to engage. A time to remember. You don't have to ponder, consider these things. You will be these things as you live in the moment. So as far as I'm concerned, under the conditions that I've shared with you today, it would be much more difficult to embrace pessimism, while optimism seems to be a no-brainer, a natural state.